My father shoved me down the stairs and told me to get rid of my child. That's not a metaphor, that's not an exaggeration, that's exactly what he said. On September 19th, inside our family home on Oak Ridge Drive in Madison, Wisconsin, my father, David Ellsworth, grabbed me by both shoulders at the top of the staircase. My 5-month-old daughter, Lily, was in my arms. He pushed me because I refused to hand my baby over to my older brother, as if she were an object, something to be borrowed, something that didn't belong to me. I caught the railing with one hand. I twisted my body instinctively around Lily, shielding her the only way a mother can. And I slid down 3 steps on my back. The carpet burned through my shirt. My wrist twisted sharply against the banister. My daughter screamed. From the top of the stairs, my father yelled that the inheritance belonged to my brother and that I needed to get rid of that child. Some nights, I still replay those words in my head, trying to understand how they came out of my own father's mouth. And it truly means more to me than you know. Now let me take you back to where this story began. I work as a dental hygienist in Middleton, just outside Madison. I pay my own rent. I file my own taxes. I haven't taken a single dollar from my parents since I was 19. And somehow in my family's eyes, I was still never enough. Growing up in the Ellsworth house meant learning one rule early. My older brother Ryan could do no wrong, and I could do no right. It wasn't subtle. When Ryan turned 16, my parents bought him a brand new Jeep. Bright, spotless, sitting in the driveway with a bow on the hood like a dealership commercial. When I turned 16, I got Ryan's old mountain bike. The one with the bent front wheel that pulled so hard to the left, it felt like it was trying to escape the family, too. I rode that crooked bike to my first job at a frozen yogurt shop and told myself it built character. Ryan went to a 4-year university. My parents paid every cent, tens of thousands of dollars, without hesitation. I went to a local community college and took out student loans I was still paying years later. One Sunday night, I finally asked my father why. He looked me straight in the eye and said Ryan had more potential. Just like that. As casually as commenting on the weather. And the hardest part? For a long time, I believed him. That's what happens when you're the invisible child. You don't realize how unseen you are until someone finally looks at you and sees everything. For me, that person was Caleb Monroe, my husband. We met at a friend's backyard barbecue in Verona when I was 26. Caleb is a diesel mechanic, rough hands, steady voice, the kind of man who notices when you stop talking and waits until you're ready to continue. He saw me long before my family ever did. The first time Caleb came to meet my parents, he wore a neatly pressed button-down and brought my mother a bouquet of tulips he'd picked up on the way over. It was a small, thoughtful gesture, the kind that says I'm trying. My mother Susan looked at him like he'd dragged engine grease straight across her soul. My father shook his hand the way you shake hands with someone trying to sell you something you already don't want. Polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. In my family, Caleb committed 2 unforgivable sins. He wasn't wealthy, and he treated me like I mattered. Apparently, both were unacceptable. We got married at the courthouse in Verona. 12 people, no speeches, no drama, the best day of my life. And the following May, our daughter Lily was born at a hospital just outside Madison. 4 pounds of determination, a full head of dark hair, and lungs strong enough to rattle the maternity ward windows. She was perfect. My parents barely acknowledged that she existed. Susan sent a text that said, "Congrats," with a period. Not even an exclamation point. My father didn't call at all. My brother Ryan, who was living in my parents' basement at the time, fresh off a separation after his wife left, sent a single thumbs-up emoji. I actually screenshotted it because at some point, the indifference becomes almost funny. You know you're low on the family priority list when your birth announcement gets less enthusiasm than a grocery store coupon. But there was one person in my family who would have cared deeply. My grandmother, Eleanor Ellsworth. My father's mother. Eleanor was the kind of woman who built things with her hands and her stubbornness. Starting in her 40s, she bought rental properties across Dane County, one at a time. She fixed them up herself. She rented them out. She reinvested every dollar. By the time she was 75, she owned 7 rental properties spread across the outskirts of Madison and nearby towns. Together, they were worth a little over $2 million. She never showed it. She drove the same car for years, used discount coupons, argued with cashiers over expired sales. But she had built real wealth, brick by brick, tenant by tenant. 3 years ago, my father moved Eleanor into Willow Creek Senior Living. He told the entire family she had advanced dementia, said she couldn't remember names, couldn't manage money, couldn't be trusted to make decisions anymore. He said it calmly, confidently, with the authority of a man people had learned not to question, and none of us did. I'm ashamed of that now. I should have visited. I should have called the facility myself. But I was 28, working full-time, planning a wedding, trying to hold my life together, and I trusted my father. That was my biggest mistake. Once Eleanor was inside Willow Creek, my father became the sole manager of everything she owned. Her properties, her bank accounts, her trust. He positioned himself as the gatekeeper between my grandmother and the outside world, and for 3 years, that's exactly how he wanted it. Then, in the middle of August, my father called a family meeting at our house on Oak Ridge Drive. He said it was about my grandmother's estate. He said it was important. He said everyone needed to be there. What he didn't say was that by the end of that conversation, he would ask me to do something so outrageous, so completely unhinged, that I would finally understand the truth. My parents didn't just prefer my brother over me. They were willing to sacrifice my child for him. August 14th. A humid evening, the kind where the air clings to your skin before you even step out of the car. Caleb and I drove to the house on Oak Ridge Drive after I finished my shift at the dental office. We left Lily with Caleb's mother in Verona. Something in my father's voice on the phone told me this wasn't going to be a casual family dinner. I wanted my hands free. I wanted my head clear. The house smelled like my mother's cooking and disinfectant, Susan's 2 signature scents. You could always tell the emotional temperature of that house by what she made. When it was pot roast, she was performing. She wanted the night to feel normal, like a family simply sitting down to talk. It wasn't. My father sat at the head of the dining table with a manila folder placed neatly in front of him. Susan stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, rigid and watchful. My brother Ryan sat in the corner chair, looking like someone who hadn't slept in months, which honestly, he probably hadn't. His hair was greasy. There was a stain on the collar of his shirt. A 36-year-old man reduced to a shadow of himself by his own choices, and still unable to see it. My father opened the folder and laid everything out. He said my grandmother Eleanor's trust included a specific clause. The grandchild who was the primary caregiver of a minor child would receive the family home on Oak Ridge Drive, valued at $450,000, along with 70% of the property portfolio. The grandchild without children would receive the remaining 30%. Because I had Lily, I qualified for the house and the larger share. Ryan did not. Then my father said the words that changed everything. He told me I had 2 options. I could sign temporary custody of Lily over to Ryan, making him the qualifying grandchild under the trust, or I could sign a separate document, giving up my inheritance entirely. Either way, he said, Ryan would get what he deserved. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain genuinely couldn't process what I had just heard. My father, my own father, was asking me to hand my 5-month-old baby to my brother, a 36-year-old man still living in my parents' basement, a man whose wife had walked out months earlier after he burned through tens of thousands of dollars on online poker and weekend trips to a casino across the state line. A man with a credit score hovering around the low 400s. I only knew that because his ex-wife mentioned it to me the one time we spoke after she left. Ryan's idea of financial planning was hoping the next hand would cover his electric bill, and now he was supposed to be the primary caregiver of an infant. My mother jumped in immediately. She placed her hand on my arm, the move she uses when she wants you to think she's being gentle, when really she's just pinning you in place. She told me this wasn't about me. She said Ryan needed this more. She said I had Caleb, I had my job, I had stability. Ryan had nothing. And family, she said, takes care of family. I looked at my mother and thought, you have never once taken care of me. Not when I needed braces at 14, and you said we couldn't afford them, 2 months before you bought Ryan a new gaming console. Not when I graduated from hygiene school and you forgot to show up because Ryan had a flat tire, and somehow that became a two-person emergency. You never once put me first. But now I was supposed to hand over my child because family takes care of family. Caleb, who had been standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw tightening by the minute, finally spoke. He said exactly 4 words. We're leaving. Now. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam anything. He just placed his hand on my back and walked me out the door. That's who Caleb is. Steady when I can't be. That should have been the end of it. But the Ellsworth family doesn't believe in endings. Starting the very next morning, my phone became a weapon. Susan texted every single day. Long, guilt-soaked messages about sacrifice and loyalty and how I was tearing the family apart. David left voicemails. Short, cold, controlled. He said I had until September 19th to make the right decision. He said if I didn't cooperate, he would make things very difficult. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't have to. My phone buzzed so much Caleb joked that I sounded like I was running for office. Between my mother's daily guilt novels, my father's quiet threats, and Ryan's one sad emoji per night, I had more notifications than a teenager on prom night. Ryan started texting me directly, too. Pathetic, half-begging messages. One said he'd take really good care of Lily. Another said he just needed the inheritance to get back on his feet. Like a baby was a ladder rung. Like my daughter was a tool for his recovery. But here's what really started eating at me. One afternoon that week, I drove past the house on Oak Ridge Drive, and something caught my eye. My father, a facilities manager at a community college, making a modest salary, was standing in the driveway beside a brand new pickup truck. The kind that costs around $65,000. Through the front window, I noticed the kitchen had new countertops. Clean, bright, quartz. Definitely not the cracked laminate I grew up eating cereal on. Where was that money coming from? I tucked that question into the back of my mind. It would matter later, far more than I realized. Caleb wanted to drive over and confront my father himself. I stopped him. Not because I doubted Caleb, but because I knew my father. If Caleb lost his temper even once, David would call the police, play the victim, file a complaint. My father wasn't stupid. He was calculating. And the only way to beat a calculator is with better math. That week, I gathered every document with my name on it. Bank statements, insurance papers, our lease, Lily's birth certificate, my marriage license. I bought a small fireproof lockbox from an office supply store near the airport for $40. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for yet. I just knew I needed to be ready. I made copies of everything and locked them inside. I was ready to cut them all off, change my number, block every Ellsworth in my phone, raise my daughter in peace and never look back. And then, on August 26th, my phone rang. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Angela Brooks. She was a nurse at Willow Creek Senior Living, the facility where my grandmother Eleanor had been placed for the last 3 years. What she told me made me realize the inheritance fight was only the surface. Underneath it was something far darker. Angela had been working at Willow Creek for about 6 months. She was a registered nurse, spoke in a calm, measured voice, the kind of person who clearly thought before she spoke. She told me she found my number on an old emergency contact form my grandmother had filled out years ago, before my father took control of everything. Angela said she had concerns about my grandmother's care, specifically about the restrictions my father had placed on her. And then she said something that made me pull my car over on Hamilton Boulevard, engine still running, hands shaking on the steering wheel. She told me my grandmother did not have advanced dementia. I sat there for almost 30 seconds, barely breathing. For 3 years, my family had told me Eleanor was gone, that she couldn't remember faces, couldn't follow conversations, couldn't function on her own. And now a nurse was telling me that was a lie. Angela explained that when she started at Willow Creek in March, the staff had briefed her on Eleanor's file. Dementia patient. Confused. Prone to paranoid accusations about her family. Standard protocol. Limit stimulation. Restrict visitors per the power of attorney holder's instructions. Redirect when agitation occurred. But none of it matched the woman she actually met. Because Eleanor Ellsworth was running a Tuesday Scrabble tournament in the common room and winning almost every single week. She had organized a Thursday book club with 9 regular members. She was halfway through a 700-page biography and had opinions about the stock market sharper than most financial advisors I've met. She told Angela that anyone without at least a small index fund was, in her exact words, leaving money on the sidewalk. All this time, my father had been telling the family his mother couldn't even remember her own name. The very first thing Eleanor told Angela the day they met was the exact balance of her savings account, down to the last dollar. This woman was sharper than a brand new pair of kitchen scissors, and my father had convinced the entire world she'd lost her mind. Here's how David did it. Step by step, like a manual for erasing a person. First, he took Eleanor's cell phone and told the staff it was overstimulating her. Second, he filed power of attorney paperwork and listed himself as the sole authorized visitor. No one else could see her without his written permission. Third, and this is the part that still turns my stomach, he told the nursing staff that Eleanor suffered from paranoid episodes as part of her dementia. So when Eleanor told the nurses that her son was stealing her money, they didn't investigate. They wrote it down as a symptom. They patted her hand. They changed the subject. A woman telling the truth, and no one believed her because her own son had labeled her crazy. Eleanor tried to get help. She asked staff members to make phone calls for her. She asked them to send letters. But she didn't have anyone's number memorized. Because honestly, who does anymore? Everything had been in the phone David took. She didn't know my new address either. I'd moved after marrying Caleb. And when your power of attorney holder has already told the facility you're paranoid and delusional, your words stop meaning anything. You become a woman shouting into a soundproof room for 3 years. Angela was different. She walked in with fresh eyes. She hadn't been trained on my father's version of reality. She saw an 82-year-old woman running book clubs, cracking jokes about cafeteria meatloaf, and organizing game nights. Then she saw the chart. Severe cognitive decline. Those 2 pictures didn't match. And in Wisconsin, Angela was what's called a mandated reporter. If she suspected elder abuse or neglect, she was legally required to act. So she dug through an old filing cabinet, found an emergency contact form my grandmother had filled out years ago, found my number, and called me. 2 days later, on a quiet morning when I knew my father would be at work, I drove to Willow Creek Senior Living. I signed in at the front desk. Angela walked me down a silent hallway to room 14B. My grandmother was sitting in a blue armchair by the window, reading a library copy of a mystery novel with a cracked spine. She looked thinner than I remembered, smaller. But her eyes were the same, quick, sharp, alive with something that 3 years of isolation hadn't managed to put out. She looked up at me, and for a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name, clear as a bell. No hesitation, no confusion, just mentioning my name. It's as if I visited her last week. I had brought Lily with me. I was breastfeeding at the time, so she went wherever I went, strapped to my chest in a soft carrier. I lifted her out carefully and placed her in Eleanor's arms. My grandmother's hands began to tremble. Not from weakness, from something much bigger than that. No one had told her I'd had a baby. 3 years in that room, and not a single person had mentioned she had a great-granddaughter. She held Lily and studied her face for a long moment. Then she looked up at me and said the baby had her nose, and she was sorry about that, because it wasn't her best feature. I laughed so hard I nearly woke the woman napping in the room next door. That was Eleanor. Even surrounded by darkness, she could still find something to laugh about. Then she grew very quiet, very still. It was a stillness I remembered from when I was a little girl, when she'd sit at her kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of rent checks, running numbers late into the night. She was in business mode. Eleanor told me her original trust, drafted by her longtime attorney Thomas Whitaker, divided everything evenly between Ryan and me. 50-50. No conditions, no clauses about children or caregiving, just a clean, fair split because, as she put it, Both grandchildren deserved the same start in life. But 2 years earlier, my father had fired Thomas. No explanation. Just told him his services were no longer needed. Then he hired Mark Delaney. As far as Eleanor understood, Delaney did whatever my father told him to do. The trust was rewritten. A new clause appeared, stating that the grandchild who was the primary caregiver of a minor child would receive the house on Oak Ridge Drive plus 70% of the property portfolio. At the time, Ryan was still married and they were supposedly trying to have a baby. My father had bet Ryan would become a parent first. Then his wife left because of the gambling. 5 months later, I had Lily. My father's rigged game backfired on him. The clause he created to help Ryan now benefited me, and he couldn't undo it without admitting he'd committed fraud. So his only way out was to force me to hand over my daughter, or walk away from my inheritance entirely. That explained the desperation. That explained the pressure. My father wasn't just greedy, he was trapped by his own lie, and by the money, and that made it worse. Eleanor told me that even before my father took her phone, she'd noticed the numbers didn't add up. Her rental properties generated about $9,000 in combined monthly rent, but the deposits into her accounts were only around $4,000. Every month, more than $5,000 simply disappeared. Over 3 years, that added up to roughly $200,000 siphoned straight into my father's pocket. He wasn't just playing favorites. He was robbing his own mother blind, while she sat alone in a room with no phone, no visitors, and a label that made no one believe her. If you have parents or grandparents in a nursing home, visit them more often. Not just on Christmas. Not just on their birthday. Go on a random Saturday morning. Sit with them. Ask how they really are, because sometimes the person you're supposed to protect is the one who protects you. That night, I sat in my car in the Willow Creek Senior Living parking lot. Lily was asleep in her car seat. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to change my number and disappear. I was going to take my father apart, legally, quietly, and completely. And my 82-year-old grandmother, the woman my father had tried to erase from the world, already had a plan. She'd been sitting in that room for 3 years with nothing but time and fury. And believe me, Eleanor Ellsworth had thought this through far more carefully than I ever could have. The first thing Eleanor told me during my second visit to Willow Creek was that revenge is best served with documentation. She said it completely straight-faced, sitting in that same blue armchair. That's when I realized my grandmother hadn't spent 3 years feeling sorry for herself. She'd been thinking, cataloging, waiting for someone, anyone, to walk through that door and give her the one thing she didn't have, a connection to the outside world. Now, she had me. And that was enough. We had 3 weeks. My father had given me a deadline of September 19th, the date of the next family meeting where I was supposed to either sign custody of Lily over to Ryan or surrender my inheritance. Fine. We would use every single day. The first call I made was to Thomas Whitaker, Eleanor's original estate attorney. His office was on 7th Street in downtown Madison, above a small sandwich shop that smelled like roast beef and mustard. The kind of place where real work gets done by people who don't need marble floors to prove they're serious. Thomas was in his late 60s, silver hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. When I sat across from his desk and explained what my father had done, his face cycled through half a dozen emotions in under 10 seconds. The last one was cold, focused anger. Thomas told me he'd been suspicious when David fired him 2 years earlier. No explanation, no notice, just a letter stating his services were no longer required. He'd considered reaching out to Eleanor directly, but David told him she had dementia and couldn't communicate, so he let it go. He said he'd regretted that decision every day since, and now he intended to correct it. He pulled Eleanor's original trust from his files. Everything was there in black and white. A clean 50-50 split between Ryan and me, no conditions about children, no caregiving clauses, fair and straightforward, exactly as Eleanor had described. Then I showed him the documents my father handed me at the August 14th meeting, the modified trust prepared by Mark Delaney. Thomas placed the two documents side by side and shook his head, like a mechanic staring at someone else's sloppy wiring job. The changes were substantial. Ryan's share had been inflated to 70%, plus the house on Oak Ridge Drive, all contingent on a clause about the primary caregiver of a minor child, something Eleanor had never approved and never signed. Mark Delaney had used my father's power of attorney to authorize the changes. That was only legal if Eleanor was truly incapacitated and the revisions served her best interests. Neither was true. Thomas said one word: challengeable. Then he said another: criminal. Step 2 was the money. That part took 2 weekends, a laptop, and roughly 4 pots of coffee. Eleanor remembered her online banking login, because of course she did. And with Angela's help accessing a computer at the facility, we pulled 3 years of deposit records. I also went to the Dane County Courthouse and requested property tax records for all 7 rental properties, public information. Then I cross-referenced the expected rental income against what was actually deposited into Eleanor's accounts. The gap was staggering. Her properties brought in roughly $9,000 a month in combined rent, but only about $4,000 ever reached her accounts. The remaining $5,000 disappeared every single month. I built a spreadsheet month by month, property by property. Over 36 months, the total came to just over $200,000. That money had been flowing straight into my father's personal checking account. And from there, some of it went somewhere I didn't expect, but I'll get to that in a minute. Step 3 was the most important piece: proving Eleanor was competent. Because my father's entire defense rested on one claim, that his mother had dementia and he was acting in her best interests. We needed a doctor to dismantle that completely. Thomas arranged for an independent geriatric specialist, Dr. Helen Morris, to visit Eleanor at Willow Creek Senior Living. She conducted a full cognitive evaluation, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, clock drawing tests, memory recall exercises, the works. Eleanor scored squarely within the normal range for her age group. Mild, age-appropriate lapses, the kind where you walk into a room and forget why you're there. Honestly, I do that at 32. That's not dementia, that's being human, doctor. Morris's written report stated, in clear clinical language, that Eleanor Ellsworth was fully competent to manage her own affairs and make her own decisions. In a separate addendum, the doctor noted that the conditions of Eleanor's isolation, no phone, restricted visitors, a sole power of attorney controlled by a family member, raised serious red flags consistent with elder abuse. That report was a grenade with the pin already pulled. We just had to decide when to throw it. By the second week of September, Thomas had assembled the full package: the original trust, the fraudulent modifications, the financial discrepancy spreadsheet, doctor. Morris's cognitive assessment, a formal complaint to the Dane County District Attorney's Office for financial exploitation of an elderly adult, a petition to revoke my father's power of attorney, and a motion to restore the original trust terms. Everything was filed on September 15th, 4 days before the meeting. And here's the part that still gives me a strange, grim satisfaction. On September 15th, while Thomas walked those documents into the DA's office, while bank records landed on a prosecutor's desk and Eleanor's cognitive assessment entered the official record, my father was at home watching a baseball game. He had no idea. The walls of his life were already collapsing, and he was sitting in his recliner thinking he'd won. Pretending I was still considering his offer during those 3 weeks was the hardest performance of my life. I called my father on September 10th, let my voice tremble just enough, and told him I was thinking about it. That I needed more time, that I understood his position. He was generous on the phone, the way powerful people get when they think you're about to surrender. He told me to take a few more days. He said he knew I'd do the right thing. I deserve an Oscar for that call, or at the very least, a gift card. Caleb and I prepared for September 19th together. It was his idea to keep Eleanor and Thomas nearby as a safety plan. He never trusted my father, not once, and he wanted witnesses close. Eleanor and Thomas would park 1 block away in Thomas's car. If anything went wrong, Caleb would text a single word, and they'd come in. Angela Brooks agreed to accompany Eleanor as her medical attendant. 3 people, 1 block away, ready if needed. Some people might call that overkill. But Caleb grew up in a house where his father punched holes in drywall when dinner was late. He recognized danger the way some people recognize weather, by the pressure shift before the storm hits. And he wasn't about to let me walk into that house without a backup plan. At that time, my savings account had about $10,000. Not a fortune, but enough to give me more options and prevent others from controlling my life. The night before September 19th, I stood in Lily's nursery at 2 in the morning, watching her sleep. She wore a onesie patterned with tiny strawberries. Her hands were curled into little fists, the way babies do, like she was already ready to fight the world without ever opening her eyes. I whispered to her that tomorrow would be hard, but everything I was doing was for her. Then I went to bed, set my alarm for 6, and didn't sleep a single minute. September 19th, a Friday, 6 in the evening. The sky over Madison had that bruised purple color you get in early fall, the kind that makes everything look like a painting and nothing feel real. Caleb drove. I sat in the passenger seat with Lily buckled into her car seat behind me. I was breastfeeding, so she went where I went. That was the simple math of new motherhood. Caleb had suggested leaving her with his mother, but Lily had been cluster feeding all week and refused a bottle. And if I'm honest, a small, stubborn part of me still believed my parents might see their granddaughter and feel something human. That was the last grain of naive hope I had left. It wouldn't survive the night. We turned onto Oak Ridge Drive and pulled up to number 550. The house looked exactly the same. Beige siding, brown shutters, hedges trimmed to military precision, and my father's new Chevrolet Silverado sat in the driveway like a trophy. Caleb parked at the curb and sent a quick text to Thomas Whitaker. "We're here." Thomas replied that he, Eleanor, and Angela were parked on Birch Street 1 block north, engine running. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. No pot roast this time. Susan wasn't performing anymore. She sat at the dining table with her hands folded, eyes down, the posture of a woman who knew exactly what was coming and had already made peace with it. My father stood at the head of the table, manila folder open. The same folder from August 14th, only thicker now. More pages, more signatures, more lines for me to sign away either my daughter or my inheritance. He'd even printed custody transfer forms. I could see the Dane County Family Court header from across the room. Ryan sat in the corner. He looked worse than last time, thinner. His knee bounced under the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. He wouldn't look at me. You know that moment when you realize someone isn't angry at you. They're not plotting. They're just drowning. And they'll grab onto anything that floats, even if it pulls you under with them. That was Ryan. I felt sorry for him for exactly 3 seconds. Then I remembered what he was willing to let happen to my daughter for a check. My father didn't waste time. He tapped the folder and said this was my last chance. He said he'd been patient. He said he'd been more than fair. He said all I had to do was sign either the custody papers or the relinquishment form, and we could all move forward as a family. I looked across that table at my father and felt something I'd never felt before. Not anger, not fear, just a deep, heavy clarity, like someone had wiped the fog off a window I'd been staring through for 32 years. I told him no, not dramatically, just no. Then I picked up Lily's car seat from the floor and turned toward the hallway. What happened next took maybe 7 seconds. It felt like 40 minutes. My father moved fast for a 60-year-old man. He stepped into the hallway and blocked my path near the top of the staircase. He wasn't yelling yet. That came later. First came the voice. That low, controlled voice David Ellsworth had used to run this family for decades. He told me I was making a mistake. He said I didn't understand what was at stake. I tried to step around him. He grabbed my shoulders, both hands, hard. I had Lily's car seat in my left hand. I tried to twist free with my right, but he didn't let go. He held me like I was something he owned, like he'd been holding this family his entire life, and couldn't physically process someone pulling away. Then he shoved. I went backward. My heel caught the top step. My right hand shot out and grabbed the railing. Pure instinct, pure motherhood. I twisted my body so my back took the impact, and Lily's car seat stayed level against my chest. I slid down 3 steps. The carpet ripped through my shirt and burned my lower back. My wrist bent sideways against the railing with a sharp, hot snap that told me something inside it had gone very wrong. Lily was screaming, that newborn scream that sounds like the world is ending. Because for her, in that moment, it was. From the top of the stairs, my father looked down at me and shouted that the inheritance belonged to Ryan, and that I needed to get rid of that child. Susan stood frozen in the dining room doorway. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched her husband shove her daughter down a staircase and did nothing. 32 years of nothing, perfectly consistent to the end. Caleb came around the corner from the living room like a freight train. He put himself between me and the stairs, helped me up with one arm, checked Lily with the other. She was crying, but she was unharmed. The car seat had done its job. My body had done the rest. My back was on fire. My right wrist was swelling fast, but my daughter was safe. That was the only calculation that mattered. Caleb pulled out his phone and typed one word, sending it to Thomas Whitaker. Then he looked at my father, still standing at the top of the stairs, breathing hard, face flushed, and said he was calling 911. My father's expression flickered. Just for a second. The first crack. 90 seconds later, the front door opened. Thomas Whitaker walked in first, gray suit, briefcase in hand, reading glasses still on. Behind him was Angela Brooks in her scrubs. And behind Angela, moving slowly with a wooden cane and an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, was my grandmother. Eleanor Ellsworth, 82 years old. The woman my father had locked away for 3 years and told the world was gone. She stood there in his hallway, looking up at him. My father's face went white. Not the white of anger or shock, the white of a man watching the ground give way beneath his feet and realizing there is no bottom. His hands began to shake. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. For the first time in my life, my father had no words, no control. No script. Ryan dropped the coffee cup he was holding. It shattered on the dining room floor, and no one moved to clean it up. Susan sank into the nearest chair like her legs had simply stopped working. Eleanor didn't yell. She didn't make a speech. She walked into the dining room, pulled out a chair, and sat at the table like she owned the place, because technically, she still did. Thomas set his briefcase on the table, opened it, and slid a single folder in front of my father. Inside that folder was everything. Dr. Helen Morris's cognitive assessment, proving Eleanor was fully competent. 36 months of bank records showing the missing $188,000. The original trust placed side by side with the fraudulent revision, and a stamped copy of the complaint filed with the Dane County District Attorney's Office 4 days earlier. David Ellsworth stared at the documents. I watched his eyes move across the pages, the numbers, the dates, the DA's letterhead, and I watched the moment it clicked. He hadn't lost tonight. He'd lost 4 days ago. Everything after that had been a dead man walking who didn't know it yet. I had never seen a person age 10 years in 10 seconds. David went from barking commands to looking like someone had just been told the IRS owned his retirement. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to speak twice, and both times nothing came out but air. Eleanor Ellsworth looked at her son across the table and said calmly, steadily, the voice of a woman who had spent 3 years rehearsing this moment. David, I raised you, and I have never been more ashamed of anything in my life. That was it. No yelling, no speech, just a mother telling her son the truth in 8 words. And somehow that was worse than anything else she could have said. Caleb called 911 just before that. 2 officers from Madison Police Department arrived a few minutes later. They documented my injuries, the carpet burns on my back, the swelling in my right wrist. Caleb gave his statement. David told them I'd slipped on the stairs. The officers noted both versions, took photos, and filed a report. They didn't arrest him on the spot, which is frustratingly normal in Wisconsin when there are conflicting domestic accounts. They told me I could pursue charges through the DA's office. I already had. We left the Oak Ridge Drive house at 7:45 that night. Caleb carried Lily. Thomas Whitaker drove Eleanor back to Willow Creek Senior Living with Angela Brooks riding along. David stood alone in the kitchen. Susan went upstairs without saying a word. Ryan sat on the back porch steps in the dark. No one said goodbye. There was nothing left to say. If you're still here, you're the reason I keep telling these stories. And if you haven't signed up yet, I really want you to join us. It means more than you think. Now let me tell you how it ended. 4 days after September 19th, on a Tuesday morning at 7:15, two detectives from the Dane County District Attorney's Office pulled into the driveway of the Oak Ridge Drive house. David was still in his bathrobe. He probably hadn't been sleeping much since Thursday night. They had a warrant for his arrest. The charges: financial exploitation of an older adult under Wisconsin elder abuse statute, elevated to a first-degree felony because the stolen amount exceeded $100,000. Theft by deception, also a felony. Simple assault, reckless endangerment, and endangering the welfare of a child. Because Lily was in my arms when he shoved me, they put handcuffs on my father in his own driveway, the house his mother had paid for, on the street where he'd spent 30 years pretending to be a respectable man. No cameras, no crowd, no dramatic showdown. Just two officers, a pair of cuffs, and the quiet click of a life locking shut. His bail was set at $75,000. He couldn't pay it. The money in his accounts was stolen money, and those accounts were frozen. David Ellsworth spent 11 days in the Dane County Correctional Facility before Susan scraped together a bond using her own savings. 11 nights on a thin mattress for a man who had just renovated his kitchen with his mother's money. There's a word for that kind of math. I think it's called justice. But David wasn't the only one. 2 weeks later, when forensic accountants finished tracing the funds, they uncovered something that hit me harder than the staircase ever had. Susan had a separate savings account at a small bank in Wisconsin, not the family's main bank, a different one, under her maiden name. Over 3 years, David had transferred roughly $34,000 into that account. Regular deposits, 3 or 4 times a month. Small enough to avoid automatic flags, my mother knew. She didn't just look the other way, she profited. Every guilt trip she laid on me, every speech about family sacrifice, every time she stood in that kitchen with her arms crossed and told me I was selfish, she had stolen money in her pocket. Susan was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Conspiracy to commit theft by deception, receiving stolen property. A felony in Wisconsin when the amount exceeds $2,000. I don't know what she said to the officers when they arrived. I imagine she was polite. Susan was always polite, right up until the moment she watched her husband shove me down a staircase and did absolutely nothing. She took a plea deal. 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of $34,000. She avoided prison time by cooperating with the DA and testifying against David. But for a woman who spent her entire life curating the perfect family image for neighbors, church friends, and the PTA, a criminal record became its own kind of cell, one she would carry everywhere. David's attorney tried to negotiate, but bank records don't lie, and Thomas Whitaker's documentation was meticulous. David took a plea: 3 to 6 years in state prison, full restitution of $187,400, money he didn't have and likely never would. He also lost his job. A community college can't employ a man with felony convictions for elder abuse and assault. 30 years of carefully maintained respectability gone in a single sentencing hearing. Mark Delaney, the attorney who rewrote Eleanor's trust under David Ellsworth's direction, didn't go to prison. But within weeks, the Wisconsin Disciplinary Board opened proceedings against him. He had altered legal documents using a power of attorney obtained under fraudulent pretenses without the grantor's informed consent. His license was suspended, and disbarment followed within 6 months. A separate forgery investigation was still open the last I heard. Some consequences move slowly, they still arrive. And Ryan, my brother, didn't face criminal charges, he hadn't stolen anything, he hadn't forged documents, he hadn't shoved anyone down a staircase. But Eleanor sat him down privately, just the two of them, and told him the truth about his share of the estate. The money was there, every dollar of his 50%. But he wouldn't receive a cent until he completed a 90-day residential addiction treatment program. If he dropped out or relapsed before finishing, his share would be redirected to a charitable trust. For the first time in Ryan's life, no one was fixing it for him. No parent swooping in with a check, no sister pressured into sacrifice, just Ryan, a program, and the choice to either grow up at 35 or lose everything for real. I don't know how that story ends. That part is his to write. Eleanor took back full control of her estate, her properties, and her life. She moved out of Willow Creek Senior Living and into a better facility she chose herself, one in Emmaus, closer to me, where she picked her own room, had her own phone, and hosted Scrabble night every Tuesday without asking anyone's permission. She sees Lily every Sunday morning. The first thing Eleanor did after getting her phone back was download a podcast app. 3 years without the internet, and she came out wanting true crime and gardening tips. She's 82 and has a better media diet than I do. Thomas Whitaker restored the original trust. 50-50, no tricks, no clauses, no conditions, except for Ryan's treatment requirement, which Eleanor added herself and had every legal right to include. The Oak Ridge Drive house went up for sale. Neither of us wanted it. Some houses carry too many ghosts, and I don't mean the spooky kind. Caleb and I used my share of the proceeds as a down payment on a house in Fitchburg. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, and a garage where Caleb immediately set up a workbench. The first morning there, I made scrambled eggs in our own kitchen, on our own stove, at our own counter. I stood there with a spatula in one hand and my daughter on my hip, and I cried, not the sad kind, the kind you earn. Caleb walked in, looked at me, and asked if I'd burned the eggs. I hadn't. That's Caleb. Our family had imploded 3 weeks earlier, and his first concern was whether breakfast would set off the smoke alarm. He'd been right all along. Every time he told me my family didn't deserve my energy, every time he said I was worth more than the scraps they threw me. It just took 3 decades and 1 staircase for me to finally hear him. We keep a jar on the kitchen counter now. Every Friday night, we each write down 1 good thing that happened that week and drop it in. On New Year's Eve, we'll read them all. Most will be small. Lily's first laugh, a perfect parking spot. A cup of coffee that hits just right on a cold morning. But that's the point. The small things are the big things. They always were. If this story taught me anything, it's this. Family is not defined by blood. It's defined by protection. By who stands between you and harm. By who chooses your safety over their comfort. By who believes you when silence would be easier. For years, I was told to endure for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace at all. It's just survival. Walking away wasn't weakness. Setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. Choosing my child over people who were willing to hurt her wasn't betrayal. It was self-respect. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining, stop shrinking, and let the truth stand on